all of our public outputs, is based on four claims that the collective has distilled from the research findings. They are: 1, loss of home; 2, it required the complicity of thousands; 3, it required reasoning wrong; and finally, dispossession is permanent. You might be following our series of stories and articles in the Nikkei Voice and Bulletin, illustrating these claims. So far, I think number 10 will be coming out in Nikkei Voice next month. Our next phase, phase 2, our current phase, phase 2, focuses on disseminating these research findings: the traveling museum exhibit, interactive digital interface, archival database, and developing teacher resources. We are planning to have a museum exhibit and book launch on Saturday, September 26th. Oops. I seem to have lost my. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of trouble here with my, I don't know what it is.
Your slides?
I'm frozen.
Oh.
Okay, I'm gonna go to plan B.
Just try doing it again. Just go to the slide you want and then try from there.
I'm going to go to a smaller version of this. You seem to be freezing up.
Oh, could be the, yeah.
Okay, how's that? Yeah, okay, sorry about that. So we're planning to have a museum exhibit and book launch on Saturday, September 26th to coincide with the release of all of our outputs. It might have a different format that we originally planned, but we're very hopeful to stick to the schedule. Stay tuned for more details. The narrative website will present the research materials in a storytelling format. Designed in an international competition, it will soon be developed into a full-fledged website with the goal to launch at the September event. Elementary and secondary teacher resource websites are also being developed in tandem with the narrative website. Having been successfully piloted and tested in over 30 classrooms in BC and Ontario, the interactive and engaging elementary school models will be disseminated through training materials on this interactive digital platform, as well as through other Pro-D activities. A highly successful output for the project was the Canada's internment era field school that incorporated the Nikkei National Museum's bus tour last July. It was an opportunity for 10 teachers and 10 students to interact and learn from those who had experienced internment and the forced uprooting in sites where it took place. Although this year's field school has been postponed to next summer, the 13 successful teacher applicants from across Canada, as far as Halifax, will take part in an online class this summer in preparation for next year's field school. It was an amazing time. Special friendships and connections were made. And for me and my daughter, it was a time of discovery. The most prominent output will be the traveling museum exhibit that will follow the stories of featured family lives through the themes of the 4 claims. It is being developed by museum professionals at the Royal BC Museum and the Nikkei National Museum, along with our curatorial museum postdoc, Yasmin Railton. Each design feature draws on rich archival resources using new research and never before seen artifacts to convey an authentic telling of the history of the dispossession of Japanese Canadians, featuring families like the Morishtas and the Ebisuzaki store. The entire machine of the mass uprooting and dispossession of an entire community required tremendous resources to generate the bureaucracy represented in the project research findings. Notwithstanding any changes due to COVID-19, our plans remain for the our plans remain for the exhibit to tour nationally, beginning at the Nikkei Nashi Museum and Cultural Center in Burnaby, to the Canadian Museum of Immigration, Pier 21 in Halifax, the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center in Toronto, and finishing at the Royal BC Museum in Victoria in 2022. The exhibit will be displayed across the country, engaging a general audience as well as Japanese Canadian community members in critical examination of the legacy of these events and their relation to the future of diversity, marginalization, and democratic citizenship in Canada. It will enable wide public access to this history, engage audiences of all ages across Canada, raise critical consciousness of this important era in Canadian history and heritage, and promote dialogue on racism and diversity. This brings us to the digital archive output that will be the focus of today's presentation. For our community members, certainly for me, I think that this might be the most impactful and exciting output of the project. Taking the hundreds of thousands of digitized pages, we're working with the Humanities Computing and Media Center at UVic to develop a user-friendly database that will help researchers and community members more easily access these documents. We're grateful to the Library and Archives Canada, one of our project partners, for digitizing the 15,000 case files. This summer, our research assistants are keeping very busy, adding metadata and preparing these files to be added to the database. The end goal is that all of the research documents acquired during the course of the project can be searched and retrieved on a single interface. So here is a sneak peek of what's in there. So yeah, please note that there'll be a snazzier interface and proper navigation and other features consistent with the design elements of the other outputs being completed. So through the magic of TV, let's do a search on Lorraine's uncle, Tatsuro Buck Suzuki. So again, this is a very utilitarian view of the interface. So we choose search. Then we choose search landscapes of injustice. We type in a name, B-U-C-K-S-U, oh, sorry. All right. And then we come up with Buck Suzuki and 118 documents, but they also include other Suzukis and Bucks. So we're looking for Tatsuro or Buck Suzuki. The score refers to how many times the search name comes up in the documents under that heading. So there are several archived oral histories from the British Columbia Archives collection. And clicking on these reveal information about the interviews, and a click to the media and a link to the audio of the interview where it says media. So there are several audio recordings involving Buck. And we also find entries where Buck has been mentioned in an oral history or in oral history interview. In this recent interview by Caitlin Finley with Leslie Barnell, granddaughter of Frank Shears, she discusses a series of protest letters from Buck and the responses from her grandfather. This was after talking about the different degrees of acceptance various family members hold related to what their grandfather had done at the time. So you can also see that we have a recording of that. And going back to the results page, we also see a series of entries with the protest letters. So clicking on the entry, the transcript appears along with a media link. And when you click on that, you see the typed document can be found. So going back outside to the search, we find that one of the first collections to be digitized were the ledger entries for the Fishing Boat Disposal Committee. There are over 1,300 of these records. So here's the record for Tatsuo's boat, Ever Ready. So we click on that. and the information appears with the link to the media. And when you click on media, then you get the digitized copy of the boat record for the Ever Ready. Here we see it was valued at $1,100, but was sold for $725 on March 13th, 1942. Then we go back out again, and then we see this result, and it points to the transcripts of the Byrd Commission case file for Tatsuro. So just a little bit of background on the Byrd Commission. So the Royal Commission on Japanese Claims, known as the Byrd Commission for Justice Henry Byrd, ran between 1947 and 1950 as support for Japanese Canadians to investigate the forced sale of their property grew. For Cabinet, it served as a way to demonstrate the government's accountability. But the terms of reference for which a person could contest the sale of their property if they thought they were sold for less than fair market value were very narrow and restrictive, and prevented many people who had lost property from submitting claims. Thus, there are only 1,400 Byrd Commission files. But the records are useful and interesting, and they provide a glimpse into the arrangements the claimants made for the property. They gave a perspective on what they claimed in 1947, including evidence like detailed lists of inventory, farm appraisal reports, diagrams of property lines and layout, and correspondence. And evidence on how they argued their case for compensation to the Commission, even within the restricted terms. Here we see on page 1 of the claim summary on the left, and on the right, the title page for the file, which indicates how much, if anything, was paid to the claimant. Let's take a closer look. In this case, Buck estimated his land to be worth $1,071, buildings $4,700, and after some adjustments, a total value of $5,000. He had received $1,931 when the custodian sold his property, leaving him with a loss of $3,069. And on the right, we see that he was awarded $1,827.74, far better than other claims I've seen. And as mentioned, the Library and Archives Canada has digitized the almost 15,000 case files of the Office of the Custodian for use in the database. These can be requested directly from Ottawa, but soon they can be accessed more easily and much faster. Virtually every Japanese Canadian with family history during the internment era should be able to find some kind of file or document. So here's the case file 11499 for Tatsuro Buck Suzuki. It begins with general information about the individual, about property, about insurance, real property, personal property owned, if there's insurance on the property or bonds. This is often where you see if they've purchased war bonds, victory bonds. And then information from the Rcmp. This is often people can find the addresses prior, during, and after the uprooting of for their relatives. And there are usually detailed property, real property summaries that contain a great deal of information about the individual situation. And sometimes photos, this one being in quite good shape, of homes and buildings can be found. Many people are excited to see handwritten letters and or signatures of their ancestors. Here is the beautiful script of Tatsuro, the style and the body of the letter matching that of his signature. And here we see a copy of the actual handwritten protest letter pages that we saw earlier in the presentation. Here's the last page of the letter. I can obtain, I think, from the builder of my house, a statement saying that to build a house like mine would cost between $4,000 and $4,500. Mr. Shears, I am not blaming you personally, but I wish to go on record as being very dissatisfied with the sale of my property as negotiated by your office. I would be very grateful for either a personal or official letter from you. Continuing, in my trust, I am sincerely yours, Tatsuo Suzuki. So it was from these documents that we searched and sent to members of the Japanese Canadian community over the past year. And I was encouraged by the reactions and gratitude from the recipients. And it was to become the impetus for these talks. We're pleased to welcome several of these community members who have agreed to share their stories and experience with these documents. Here's an example of one of the responses I got from Gail Koyanagi when she received her files. She said, reading the proceedings from the Japanese property claims hearing was chilling for several reasons. Since I'd never met both my grandfathers, it was the first time I'd heard my grandpa Endo's voice, though mediated through the interpreter and the print. It filled me with such anger to experience even secondhand, even after so many years, the disrespectful, unjustified way our people were treated. Reading about it this way was an incredibly powerful experience. Just wondering if the Nikkei National Museum has any plans to do some kind of installation of this information. I think it would be particularly topical and relevant with regard to the current increase in reported incidents of racism and violence towards Asian Americans and Canadians. Again, thank you for the opportunity to connect in a unique way with past family members. All the best, and yours in health. So you can see that, so I did reach out to those that had received their files and some of the people who had responded. And I asked them the following, briefly, what did you already know about your family history? Upon receiving family files, what were you and your relatives' initial reactions? Were you able to learn more about your family history, confirm facts, or learn new facts? And if so, could you give us some examples? And any comments on your experience? So on last Wednesday, we started off talking with Laureen. So this is, we'd given Laureen files on the Oikawas and Doi family. But we used this, the Buck Suzuki example because it's her uncle. So I just wanted to ask her if she could comment a little bit about seeing these ones, I think on Wednesday for the very first time.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, it was interesting, our conversation, and then it led into for you to search out these documents and share more with me. And one of your questions was, what do you know about your history? Well, okay, the Suzuki Oikawas came in 1906 on a ship going to Suan Maru. They settled on Oikawa Island. They were fishers, boat builders. My uncle Buck was involved as a child as a fisher in the fishing community, became a leader in the Steveston fishing community, spokesperson. He was trying to broker a deal where the white union would accept Japanese cane fishers, because at the time they didn't. Was working on that, then internment hit. So then he and his family and 22,000 get forcibly removed. He happens to be the first person back to Steveston after the war, and then restarts his work advocating for fishers, and then also becomes, we didn't call it at the time, environmentalist. He fought for protecting our environment, protection of the water and fish habitats. So I kind of knew that, and he's well known in the community, but it's just, like you said, it's the personal. I didn't know what happened to his boat. So to have these documents, it just kind of shakes you. And I know through the Byrd Commission, it was, it made me a little bit like the woman you read out the letter, it made me angry that their property,
a lot of emotion on one.
Yeah, there's a lot of emotion. It devalues their property, devalues them as humans. And then the Byrd Commission, where they actually had to fight to say it wasn't fair and basically try to win them over, although it was, their minds were already made up. They weren't prepared to surrender everything, although he was fortunate to get some money. But anyway, to fight for that. And then there was this one letter in the whole documentation of the Byrd Commission that, yeah, this letter. And then it just struck me, and it got me a little angry too. It says, oh, well, the former Suzuki property was sold to Mr. L.W. Law, a veteran, as if to make it all right. He was a veteran. And I think, hey, my Uncle Buck tried to enlist with the Canadian Army. The military rejected him. He actually became part of the British Army as an intelligence officer. And then my cousin said later on, the Canadian Army said, oh no, he was lent to the British Army. No mention that they rejected him at first. So he's loyal, and yet they're trying to dismiss it all and say, oh, well, no, it's okay because we gave it to a veteran. Well, he was a veteran himself. He took his property.
We'll hear a little bit later too.
Yeah, and then just, and thanks for sharing the one letter with his, the handwritten. Because
yes.
Because that's the one thing, that's the thing that we forget. Like, I've never seen it, even though he wrote it. I've never seen this letter. I've never actually really seen his writing. So it's just so powerful to see. It just brings you closer to your family to see that's his writing. Those are his words. And just to show his dignity, and that he was so articulate, and the way the wording, or like you said, the descendant of the government official who said that he was respectful, very professional, so not blaming you personally, but I disagree, this is wrong. And then just the sign off too, just that flourish of continuing in my trust, I am sincerely yours.
Yeah.
Oh, very powerful. Anyway, thank you very much. And I think,
thank you.
Yeah.
So we've got some.
Just to say, I am a vice chair of the steering committee, so a little bit biased too. I am very proud to be associated with this project, and the NAJC is as well.
Yes.
So, but thank you very much.
Thank you. So moving right along, that we've got the second half, we'll be talking with some guest speakers. Reiko Plo from New Brunswick, thank you for joining us. Stacy Inoue, special thank you to Stacy for her many hours volunteering, pulling index cards and setting up Excel spreadsheets for easier referencing. We really appreciate your valuable contribution. And then third up, we'll have Kate Michi Ettinger, and she joins us from San Francisco. And I've only just recently corresponded with Reiko and Kate, but I know you're in for a real treat. Their stories are incredible as well. And David, we'll finish with David Iwasa. Needs no introduction. He led this amazing Lethbridge Sugar Beet bus tour last October, and he's really knowledgeable about both sides of his family. We could do a whole chat with him, but he'll say a few words. Despite that, he did learn some things from looking at the file, from receiving the files. So I've got some slides here on the PowerPoint. So if you just want to continue when we call you, you can just explain, and we'll just move the slides. So Reiko, if you're there, if you'd like to open your video, but definitely unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you see me? Is my video working? I don't know.
I've got
Is it working?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. Okay, so hi, my name is Ray, and I'm here on the traditional unceded land and waters of the Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Wolastoqiyik, and Mi'kmaq peoples in New Brunswick. And I can't help but first use this platform to address the current issue of policing Black and Indigenous lives in North America, and calling on all Japanese Canadians to pledge in solidarity with Black and Indigenous people who suffer disproportionately at the pleasure of the carceral system that we as citizens in Canada participate in upholding. Anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism is a problem for non-Black and non-Indigenous people to address and dismantle. So please act for Wet'suwet'en, Regis, Korchinski, Packet, residents of the downtown east side, those in immigration detention, and for Black and Indigenous people everywhere. In the words of Layla F. Saad, be a good ancestor.
Thank you.
Okay, so The brief history of my Japanese Canadian family goes back to a Shinto priesthood in Shiga, which my great-grandfather Nakataro Matsubayashi renounced when he moved to Vancouver in 1902 to become a jeweler and watchmaker. He was a business owner for over 40 years in the Powell Street neighborhood. My great-grandmother Kocho was diagnosed with manic depression in 1931 and was institutionalized at Riverview Hospital in Coquitlam until death of tuberculosis in 1943. The Matsubayashis were in Bay Farm during the war. My grandpa's side, the Itos, were sent to Lemon Creek, but my grandpa and his brother were detained at Angler POW camp. My grandpa was a fisherman before the war and lost a gill netter named Stardust, which we have a photo of eventually. There. It's always angered me that my grandpa was treated like a criminal when he was innocent. The record of his arrest in the LOI files was particularly invaluable to me, as terrible as it is, because it describes that moment in time in a way that shed light on my grandpa's unjust treatment. And I can't be alone in thinking that receipt for his living body attached here too is chilling and problematic. I also didn't know his address in Vancouver before, so that was a new discovery. The records concerning my family's war savings certificates, lost life insurance policies, and hospital fees were also illuminating but difficult to grapple with. And I just speak for myself when I say that the effects of forced poverty are still felt in my family today. It was amazing to learn the names of my grandma's siblings who died as infants, as well as what happened to their ashes. My great aunt's letters are consistent, pressing, slightly snarky, and yet so polite, requesting that the ashes be returned. She also lists some items that I'd been unaware of before, such as Japanese gowns with the family crest embroidered on them. And that's kind of all I had to say. I kind of rushed through it, but thank you very much for the opportunity. And I also wanted to dedicate this little brief history to my great aunt Kay Iwasa, née Matsubayashi, who passed away on May 8th from COVID-19. So may she and all of our ancestors rest in peace, and may we make them proud. Thank you.
Our deepest condolences. So thank you for that. Yeah, you also have located where your ancestors are buried.
I did. So I guess through the passing of my great aunt, we've reconnected with the Iwasa side of our family, and they were able to tell me that the ashes and my great grandmother and great grandfather are all buried together in Hamilton, Ontario, in a one grave site there.
And that's where your mother was born?
Yeah.
Oh, we probably know your family. I was born and raised in Hamilton.
Okay, wow.
You did talk about these fees. The Provincial Board of Health, $4,600, but you actually put a price tag on what it would be today.
Right. I was curious. I kind of like shortened my original thing because I wanted to say that thing at the beginning. But
Okay.
yeah, I looked into like inflation for what around like $4,000 hospital bill would be 1943 versus now, and it's about 70 grand. So I'm sure that was like difficult to pay up at the time.
Well, thank you very much for your insights, Reiko, and again, our condolences on the loss of your aunt. Your grandmother? Sorry.
My great aunt, yeah.
Your great aunt. Okay.
She was the last of the Matsubayashi sisters, sadly, but yeah.
And that brings us to Stacy. Stacy, are you there?
I am.
Hi, Stacy.
Hello. So you had asked a little bit about what we knew about our family history. So my great-grandparents, they were all the Issei's, and I knew basic facts about them, where they lived in Japan, that one family lived on Sea Island and then returned to Japan in the 1930s because of my great-grandfather's health. That my great-grandmother was a midwife at the Fisherman's Hospital in Steveston, and that one of my great-grandfathers ran a hardware store on Powell Street. And then they went to Slocan and New Denver after that before coming to Toronto. and another family ended up in Manitoba, and then again in Toronto. So I knew basic information about them. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents, they really didn't like to talk too much about their pre-war life. But my paternal grandmother is almost 99, and she's still able to talk about it and is willing to share with us the information that she knows. When we ask her specific questions about things, she'll answer the questions, but she won't sit down and just tell us a story. In terms of some of the initial reactions that we had, so the Byrd Commission report, Mike, you gave me that while we were on the bus tour last summer, the internment camp tour. So that was a very interesting read about my grandfather. And I was pretty shocked when I read it. And when I got home, I shared it with the rest of the family, and they were all pretty shocked too. My uncle, my grandfather's son, said to me, "What do you mean he wasn't a fisherman?" Because my great-grandfather had been a fisherman. They lived in Steveston. Everyone kind of assumed he was a fisherman. Turns out he worked for the River Fish Company, and he was a store clerk there. So there were a few surprises for us in the documents. You know, some of my cousins read the files, and one of them came back and said, you know, it was so interesting and yet so sad at the same time to see what they had lost as a result of the internment, and, you know, to see that itemized list of things that they had left behind and then the government then sold off. It was a sad thing to see, and kind of makes you mad to see those kinds of things. When we got the actual case files that NAJC put together for me, it was surprising to see the level of detail that was in them. One person had a 6-page file, another person had a 160-page file. So it's interesting to see that level of detail vary based on the person and what they had or didn't have and the things that they were involved in. And, you know, as somebody that's had a computer in front of her for her entire work life, I just can't imagine how they managed to keep all those files and put them together and everything manually back in the day, right? In terms of
with this version of the PowerPoint, I lost the pictures of the house. Too bad. They're really great pictures. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Yeah, so we found out, one of the things we found out was that the hardware store on Powell Street that my great-grandfather had run, no one really knew who had owned the house and the building and what they did with the business or anything like that at the end, or when they evacuated out to Slocan. But we found out through the file that they didn't own the house. It had been rented from a French-Canadian company, and that they had actually liquidated all the stock that they had prior to their evacuation. And then on my grandmother's side, she had been living in Paldy. My grandfather worked for the Mayo Lumber Company there, and they had let the Japanese Canadians leave some of their belongings in a Japanese hall there when they evacuated out to Hastings Park. So this letter, I think, shows some of the things that my grandmother had left there. And this is the letter that she wrote back to, or it's a piece of a letter that she had written back to Mr. Mayo, who ran the company, saying, "Can you please send me my belongings that I left there to my address in Picture Butte, where they were sugar beet farming?" And so she actually received her belongings back, and they didn't have a lot because they lived in company housing out in the bush in Paldy, right? So they had a few things, and one of them was that Singer sewing machine at the top of that list. And she has a Singer sewing machine in her bedroom today. And I said to her, "So that sewing machine, is that the one that's in this letter?" And she said yes. So, you know, it's gone from Paldy on Vancouver Island in the bush to Picture Butte and to Northern Ontario and all the way to Toronto over the past 80-ish years, right? So it's pretty amazing.
That is amazing. Yeah, we have some Paldy's connections as well.
Yeah. So, you know, I'm very grateful to you and the whole Landscapes of Injustice team for having this information and sharing it. I know there's things that we definitely learned that otherwise we would have never known, right? The generations have passed on and we wouldn't have had the opportunity to learn this information. So we're very grateful for all that information that you've passed along to us. And for people that are on the meeting that haven't seen their files, when that website becomes available in September, definitely go check it out, see what you can learn about your families. And I guess, Mike, I'll put up this last quote. This is one that I read this past fall, and it's Mary Manco Haskett, and she was a World War I internment survivor. And she said, "Because no one bothered to remember or learn about the wrong that was done to us, it was done again to others and yet again. And maybe there's an even greater wrong in that." So again, just thank you to your team for helping us to remember and learn.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words and also for all your help over the year. And it's great being on, well, actually with both bus tours together. So thank you. And next up we have Kate. That's not Kate. Hi, Kate, are you there?
Hi, I'm here.
Okay.
Okay.
I was just going to say that's not a picture of you per se
It's not a picture of me?
on the screen.
You can't see me?
I can see you.
Oh.
With you now.
Well, thank you, Mike, and the Landscapes of Injustice team. And thank you, Ray, for sharing your time for that important message.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. So I came to this resource actually a bit sideways. Shortly after the redress in the early 90s, my mom had started a family history project focused on her grandfather, Koichiro Sanmiya, who was a business leader in the early Canadian-Japanese community in Vancouver. And we know a fair bit about Koichiro from my grandmother's memories and family photographs. He served on the board of the Alexander Street Language School. He was a serial entrepreneur. I think maybe he was just waiting to find the right business, but he had a restaurant and an import-export business. He had a stint owning the Canadian Daily News, which sponsored the beloved Asahi baseball team. And he served in the community, business community, as president of the Canadian-Japanese Association. But I think that success finally came when he returned to his roots, making sake. And so he had the first malt and sake license in British Columbia, which was the only legal sake brewery in the Prohibition era. And all we knew was that the sake factory was in a building behind the family home. Koichiro died in 1931, so his story was not impacted by the internment, except that sort of the whole story was lost because of the internment, as I think is true for so many people. And his wife, Morio, sold the sake business and then acquired a dressmaking business. And so last year, I began to help my mom with her grandfather's biography. She just had these boxes sitting in her bedroom for like 30 years and said, "I'm going to finish my grandfather's biography." And I was like, now. And COVID has helped with that since we're all inside. So we knew a lot of facts, but we had no dates, no addresses, and nothing to corroborate any of our family stories. And I found in a newspaper search an address, 640 East Cordova Street, that was listed with the name M. Sanmiya. So I started asking people, where can I find property records? And Lisa Ueda from the Nikkei Museum said, "Oh, you have to talk to Mike Abe and the Landscapes of Injustice Project." And so we got connected, and from these records, we learned a lot of things just about sort of the family actually owned the lot where the sake factory was, and rented the house in front. And when Morio started her own business, she sort of copied the model that had worked well for her husband. I think it was sort of a nice learning, and she built a factory behind her the home at 640 East Cordova Street. You know, the papers that come with all of this, the letters back and forth, show this kind of gross undervaluing of the property. Morio had hoped to receive $6,000 for her property at the time of evacuation, and in the end, she received about $3,000. And you can see just by reading the correspondence how that came to pass, with excessive appraisals, each person taking a fee, just gross undervaluing, years of taxes that were required even though it had been dispossessed, and anyway, commissions. And you know, I think that sort of the starkest example is just this household inventory. This went on for 3 or 4 pages, and at the end, she had a $409 for the household belongings. And this letter from the furniture appraiser offered $40 for all of that. So you sort of see very clearly the situation. As for kind of what was confirmed and learned on the internment specifically side, when I was in the 8th grade, apparently Mike also did, but I interviewed my grandfather, Mitz Nakamura, for a primary source history project. I wonder how many other 8th graders did this experience too. So I asked him all these questions, completely ignorant about the horrors that I was forcing him to remember. And he described how the non-Japanese people had come around and bought up everything just before the evacuation for almost nothing, and how the whole family stayed together in a horse stall. And he was relieved that my grandmother and her mother were able to leave to join my grandmother's elder brother, Marm, who was a medical student outside of the evacuation zone in Edmonton. But my grandfather was Kibe. He was born in Canada, had returned to Japan at age 3, and he remained there until he was 19. So he was educated in Japan, limited English. He had just returned to Canada 5 years earlier. He was, an enemy. And so his paperwork took longer, and they sent him to a farm, and he described his experience on this farm where he was picking up rocks. He was covered in dust, gasping for air, his asthma, anyway, he said it was worse than you would treat a dog. And then he sort of interrupted the interview and left the room. And, I was left with this realization that I was the only person that he had ever told this to, and it sort of seared his pain on my heart. From the Landscapes of Injustice project, I learned that my grandmother was in Lucky Strike, Alberta, before reaching Edmonton, and that my grandfather was at Hepburn Farm in St. Thomas, Ontario, so family separation. My mom and her sisters had thought the whole family was together in Lethbridge, so this was sort of all new information to everyone. And now I wonder whether the family ended up settling in London, Ontario, because they wanted to be closer to my grandfather. Anyway, so we have all these answers that give us more questions, and sadly this generation is gone, so they'll remain question marks forever. And I'll just close by sharing the sort of emotions that I felt. To see each person reduced to a number is chilling. The index cards that meticulously cataloged and cross-referenced family members with their numbers like library books. I felt the despair at this indignity. Lives stripped bare and valued belongings reduced to line items on a questionnaire, and everything plundered. I felt an outrage at this injustice. And finally, just witnessing the artifacts of this dehumanizing process in action, seeing what enables people to treat other people worse than dogs, I felt this disgust at the inhumanity. So I just wanted to sort of say the part that I didn't have time to include was actually some of the reflections from the transcript of the Byrd Commission, and I encourage anybody who has any of that in their family history to read through it carefully. It's very rich. I've sort of since realized that my great-grandmother Morio's story is one that also needs to be told. So I'm going to work with my mom to make sure both my great-grandparents' stories are kind of brought into the light. The question that has sort of stayed with me since I interviewed my grandfather in 8th grade was, what is our responsibility as bystanders to injustice? And, as I review these files about my family's injustice, I'm grateful and humbled that our community was able to receive redress within 50 years, knowing that so many others have not had that fortune. And that there are more injustices, as I live in the United States, happening far too often. So there's much work to be done. And thank you to the National Association of Japanese Canadians for hosting this chat, and Mike and the Landscapes of Injustice Project for your important work that helps to heal and honor the experiences of our community.
Thank you so much. You can just see, I can just feel the emotion of all of our speakers, and we witnessed that on Wednesday as well. We had hoped to do this in person, some sessions similar to this in Vancouver at the Nikkei National Museum when we did our launch. So it's kind of nice that we're able to do it more nationally and internationally as well in the States. But I think if we were to do it, we would make sure that we have counselors and professional people there to help us deal with the trauma as we go through these discoveries. So thank you very much for your thoughts and your wonderful memories. And I do remember that at grade 8 trying to learning for the first time, talking with my father, and he was very reluctant to tell us to talk about it. So thank you very much. And we have one more speaker. David, are you there? David Iwasa.
Okay, there I am.
Hi, David.
Hi,
See you
thank
again.
you. It's a pleasure to be able to be on this. I've really appreciated the comments by everybody else, and so I'll be relatively brief. The first question you asked was, how much do we know about our family history? In my particular case, it's something that's been a sort of been pretty committed to this for some time, and I've done quite a bit of work on our family history. We're sort of different in that my father's side immigrated to Alberta in 1908, and so they were not evacuated. But my mother's side was in Langley, and they were forcibly relocated and ended up in southern Alberta. And my father was also unusual in that he was able to join the Canadian Army, and he served overseas in the Canadian Army in Europe, and landed in Normandy and went through all of the experiences of the Canadian Army there. Fortunately, was able to come home safely. And when he left southern Alberta, there were 500 something Japanese in southern Alberta. When he came back, there were 3,500. He said that the dating pool was quite a bit better as a result. And so that's how he met my mother. And so in a sense, the evacuation brought my mother to southern Alberta so she could meet my father. I know a lot about my father's side, but I didn't know much about my mother's side. I knew dates and names, where they died and so forth. But thanks to the information that you provided through both the Byrd Commission files and others, it sort of revealed a lot. On my mother's side, she was a Kinoshita. My father's side is from Hiroshima. My mother's side is from actually Fukuiken and Shigaken. And so I got to know a little bit about my grandfather on my mother's side, and the Kuichi Kinoshita farm. We hadn't known anything about it, when it was purchased, how big it was. We should have asked those things and talked about it with my mother, but we never did. Thanks to this, the information we got through these files, we learned a lot about what had happened, and the efforts that he made to try and preserve it by renting it out to, leasing it out to someone just prior to the evacuation. But all sort of came to naught. The other part that became what was very interesting is my great uncle on my mother's side. This is Kinoshita Seiichi, Seiichi Kinoshita. The interesting aspect about his life and about his farm is that he's a veteran of the Canadian Army in the First World War. And what it is that he was able to buy his farm as a First World War veteran, and through the Veterans Land Authority. And the ironic thing is that at the evacuation, the land was taken away from him and given to other veterans through the Veterans Land Authority. In fact, he made a claim to ask for his land to be given back to the Veterans Land Authority. And they asked if he had received any funds through the Byrd Commission and whether or not the land had been paid for by the government. Since he did receive a little bit of money, he received a very small amount, they said, well, his claim was nullified because he had sold it. He needed the money to survive in the evacuation, and then they said that that was the excuse as to why he couldn't get his land back. Yeah, just to read this is
That's something.
these letters is just is sad. My great uncle in the First World War was gassed during the war and came back as an invalid, and he felt personally insulted when they took away his land. At the beginning of the evacuation, there are a few things that were sort of interesting. He was asked to serve as a member of the Veterans Guard at Hastings Park. So he went there. He thought that he would not be evacuated as a result, or forcibly relocated. He moved his family to Vancouver, and they rented a house to stay there while he was serving at Hastings Park. But ultimately what it is that after Hastings Park was closed, then he was also moved and sent to Tashme. And from there, at the end of the war, they came to Alberta, and so that's where they ended out. Reading through the material, I went through many of the same sort of feelings that others did in learning about the matter-of-fact way in which lifelong things that they had treasured and held and were protecting, how they were just casually treated. Much of it was destroyed as a result of vandalism and just pure incompetence on part of the BC Security Commission. And so learning about all of these things, I think, is important. I think we became more appreciative. I certainly did. I thought I knew a lot about the situation, but when you read the firsthand accounts, you read the claims, they're talking about differences of $10, $15, and before the Byrd Commission, the counsel for the commission quibbling about things like $30, and going back and forth as to whether or not it was valid or not, and all of these sort of just minor teeny details, when the whole injustice of the whole process was being ignored, became something that struck me very forcibly. I really appreciate all of the work that was done on this, and I'm excited that all of this is going to be available, through the website and digitally accessible. I think everyone needs to have a chance to take a look at this and see it. And so, thanks to you, you've given me an insight into my mother's side of the family in a way that I would never have had the opportunity otherwise. So thank you so much.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Eric, all of the speakers. I know we're running out of time. I just want to summarize quickly, and then maybe wanted to stay on for a few questions or take down my information here and send me an email. But I wanted to thank everyone for their powerful and moving stories. I think that there could be 14,000 more stories out there. And we can see evidence how these stories and files relate to our 4 claims of dispossession. They all spoke of loss of home, whether real property or intangible. Certainly the farms and buildings for David. We see evidence of the complicity, whether the sellers or buyers of thousands of household items at auctions, or as noted by Stacy, the many people needed to maintain the enormous amount of records. We see vast correspondence between the government and the community, and the cordial yet officious replies as bureaucrats try to justify their actions. And our claim that dispossession is permanent, as Reiko has mentioned, still feeling the effects of expenses and financial hardships imposed by the dispossession so many years later. So thank you to all our speakers and all of you, the viewers, for tuning in, to Laureen and Kevin at the NAJC for this opportunity. And just a real thank you to all our partners and to the research collective who has been working so hard on this project for the last 6 years and will continue for the next year and hopefully beyond. So I'll hand it over to Laureen. I don't know if she wants to do a few questions and ask people if they want to stay, they can. If not,
Yes,
that's
definitely.
fine.
Thank you, Mike. Applause, applause, applause. Thank you, Mike. Another great session. We had a fantastic session last week, and thank you again, as Mike has said, to all the speakers. I think that's the most important, right? They weren't just numbers. These are our families. So very important to share those stories. But yeah, it's hard. I was actually just on a federal government town hall, and I was sharing about Japanese Canadian seniors and racism, and I was telling Mike, I'm glad I had a little bit of break before I came on this one. It's draining. But anyway, important information, and it is the 1 hour time limit, but if you want, I'm willing to continue it on. So if anybody wants to stay on and has a question, we were covering some in the chat. And I'll just quickly look in the chat here. I think we covered, so the recording will be on the najc.ca. Jordan Sanger-Ross, who's a project director, who's on the call. He answered a couple of questions here, I think. And definitely thank yous to Mike, thank yous to Jordan. What else? Just quickly checking here. Okay, so lots of thank yous, recording, thank yous. Oh, we've got one of the research assistants too, LOI research assistants, Zoe Blue Coats. Thank you.
Oh, the work study. Yeah, she did
sorry
a lot of these.
there was a lot of people on here, so it's hard
Oh, wow.
scrolling through. Kim, thank you. Kim Ueda Kai is from the Toronto member, the chapter, NAJC chapter. Thank you. Oh, and Kim is saying she's very excited for the fall when she can learn out more about both sides of her family and find out more about her grandfather's fishing boat. Thank you. Greg Nesterov has a question. Will the book and website launch? When are the days for the book and website launch?
Okay. Hi, Greg. The book will be, the release date is in August. You can go on McGill Queen's Press. Maybe Jordan can throw that website up.
There we go. Jordan's put a link in the chat there. You want to click
There
on
you
that
go.
link? Thank you, Jordan. The book should be available by August.
Yeah. Thank you.
Landscapes and Justice.
And what was the other one? The museum exhibit?
And the website launch.
Oh, the website
for the
launch. If all goes according to Hoyle, it'll be in mid-September. Keep an eye on the bulletin, the Nikkei Voice, to our newsletter, to NAJC. We'll announce all of these outputs as they get rolled out and launched.
Yes, and if sign on to, if you go to najc.ca, you can sign on. Maybe I'll get Kevin to put the link for the NAJC, sign up for the e-news. And the e-news, we share things important to the community like Landscapes of Injustice, the Nikkei Museum information, and of course, any of the NAJC online programming. So we'll continue to be doing these NAJC chats with different members in the community. Okay, another question. Many thanks for the work you've done. Oh yeah, information on Japanese Canadians who lived in Cumberland. Well, actually, my mother's side, Doy's, Cumberland, and David Iwasa's family, Cumberland. So yes, there will be information on Japanese Canadians. There already is information on Japanese Canadians who lived in Cumberland.
And that was the great thing about this project and bringing on Library Archives and Archives of Canada as a partner and having all these case files available. We originally were just the 4 study sites, Steveston, Salt Spring Island, Powell Street, and Haney. But with these case files, we're able to provide files for virtually all of the different communities and Japanese Canadians, wherever they live on Vancouver Island or along the coast.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Oh, and Kevin's just said, basically go to najc.ca. If you scroll to the bottom of the page, you add your name and email, and then you will get our e-news. So open to anyone, and you'll get all the Japanese Canadian information. Okay. Oh, and Jordan has a tip. He says, don't buy the cloth book for $130. The paperback is $39. Okay, there you bargain.
Very good.
Oh, Keiko Miki, she's vice president of the NAJC, saying thank you very much. Enjoyed it. Faye Ishii, thank you.
Oh, Faye was on our, oh, she was even in the photo. She's on the bus tour there. Hi, Faye. Thank
I
you.
know, this is great. I love seeing everybody's names and.
But Wednesday, we definitely had more time for questions, and we had more questions, and I had follow up about the bus tour, about the museum exhibit. The other day, we had the bus. We had questions about where the museum was going, and whether there's opportunities to bring it to Vernon, to Hamilton, to where else did they say, Alberta. So yeah, we will be reaching out to various museums and community centers about venues for the traveling museum, either during its trip across Canada or after. Here's something about the sugar beet.
Oh, and David Iwasa led the sugar beet tour that Mike mentioned. And there's a documentary film
Oh, right, yeah.
coming out this fall. So he says, well, hopefully we'll repeat that experience again. We're looking forward to it. Another tour, David. Definitely.
Yeah, that would be great.
Oh, some more thank yous. Jim and Margaret Suzuki.
Hey, Les.
Oh, I switch it back so we can see our faces better.
All right.
No, more thank yous. Yukati, thank you. April.
Oh, my cousin.
Oh.
April. And I got another cousin down there.
I know. I'm starting to think that if we just talk to each other, eventually we figure out that we're somehow related through cousins and.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. Oh yeah, thank you, Natsuki. We do have a newsletter as well for Landscapes of Injustice.
Okay.
And they're also archived on our website, so you can go back and you can read all that series of the 4 claims, as well as all different articles related to Landscapes of Injustice.
Some great information there. Oh, sorry, forgot to. Les Takahashi is also from the Toronto chapter of NAJC.
Yes, I see him. Nice to see you again, Les. He was on the bus tour.
Great.
We had some really great chats, especially about food. Japanese
food. I know. we did have John on a NAJC chats, and so we're saying we want to do more food. So we might be doing more food NAJC chats.
Nana Sakamoto, I'll send you the link, or just Google Nikkei Voice, and it's very inexpensive to subscribe. I think it's $40 a year. There's 10 issues. It's really great. It's really great. It's sort of a newspaper format, about 18-20 pages, and it comes out every month. And then there's also the out of Toronto.
JCCA. So that one's based in Toronto, but it ships anywhere across Canada.
Yes, across.
The Bulletin based in Vancouver, but it can be shipped everywhere.
Exactly.
Too. Magazine format. Kate, thank you for organizing.
Yeah, thank you, Kate, for your participation. And Reiko, I didn't get a chance to thank you for speaking out before your talk. I didn't know how much time we did have, but yeah, that's very important. You must be, now that I see you look familiar. You're probably involved with the Vancouver group, the young group. And it's really great to see our next generation so involved in social activism and social justice. So thank you for those comments. Very important, especially in today's time.
Yes, Mary Kitagawa was saying that, the intergenerational pain, very evident.
Oh, KikiI, are you part of that? Oh, there. Okay, I see that. Yeah, KikiI, that's the Vancouver group.
Oh, yes.
They're reading Politics of Racism. Wow, that is our one of the cornerstone books.
That came up in the town hall that I was on this morning about the COVID-19 racism. directed against
And
it.
that politics of racism is now you can just get a link to read it. I think if Jordan can put that up. And the tapes of Ansunahara have been documented by, been digitized by the Nikkei National Museum. So I think they're available as well.
Oh, right. I think I did see something on one of the notices about that. Okay, that's great. So this has been, oh, there we go. Thank you,
Okay,
Jordan.
thanks, Jordan.
JapaneseCanadianHistory.ca. Awesome. Okay, I think that's it, unless anybody has a last minute question. Thanks for hanging on there. It was nice to get in.
Yeah, thank you so much to our speakers and to our viewers.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us, and sign up for the NAJC e-news and you'll find out more about the other events and other people in our community that we're going to be speaking to. Thanks everyone.
And ours too.
Enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye.
Bye.